Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Every problem that has a political or geopolitical angle has a larger economic angle associated with it. There is an economic dimension of every conflict on the face of earth. To explore the problem further on a part of the economic angles associated with it, we have invited an economic expert who sits in Europe and is going to tell us more about the economic challenges that Europe is facing at the moment. I am honored to be joined by Dr. Bilal Baghis. He's an economist and expert of economics based in Istanbul. Dr. Bilal, I welcome you to the program.
Thank you, Syed Shabat. Thank you for having me.
Dr. Bilal, anti-European Union or anti-Europe sentiment is on the rise and has an economic angle to it. Many believe there is a disparity between various European nations. Would you agree with this statement?
Well, inequalities in the EU, they are definitely on the rise, and these rising economic inequalities, they are believed to have increased this anti-EU sentiment and decrease, of course, the public trust in the EU and its institutions, both directly and indirectly. And this includes the EU institutions such as the European Central Bank, their monetary policy decisions, including the most recent QE policies of the past decade. And inflation rates in the euro area, they also reached a new high of 8.6% in June. And this also affects the poor disproportionately, of course. And along with that, the political stance against Russia and increasing food and energy prices, they are all adding to this mistrust, I would say.
Dr. Bilal, I was reading one of the reports published in one of the international papers, and it says that with energy prices rising further, the inflation rate is going to hit 11% in autumn in England. Now, a mainstream economy, England, that is one of the economic powerhouses of Europe. We see England, France, Germany being the icons of Europe. How it is going to affect the rest of the Europe, and what does it tell us about the gravity of situation in Europe?
So the inflation rates in the UK, they are already at the 40-year high of 9.1%. And the Bank of England is expecting a further rise up to 11% in October, along with the energy prices. So that is indeed one of the reasons the European leaders and G7 leaders, they were talking about price caps on oil especially. And in general, like broadly speaking, inflation rates in the US, UK, Canada, even Australia, New Zealand, they're all at their 40-year highs. And in many European economies, inflation rates are at their 30-year highs. And this is also indeed the primary reason the world economy is facing a tightening cycle, in especially the Western world, and rising in interest rates. And these, of course, could, in the medium term, lead to another potential recession.
Dr. Bilal, European economies are trying to strangulate the Russian economy as much as possible with the help of various kinds of sanctions. And we see a different kind of sanctions coming after every week or 2 weeks. But Russia has announced recently that when the winter comes, they are going to cut down the gas supply to 60%. How fearful is this announcement for Europe?
So the newly built Nord Stream 2 project is already paused. It's not active. And supply from Nord Stream 1 pipeline, as you just pointed out, it is decreasing. So Russia is a critical supplier of energy, including oil and gas, to the European economies. And Russia has 19% of all gas reserves around the world. Its biggest natural gas exporter, second biggest oil exporter. And in 2021, Russia was providing 25% of all European Union's oil demand. It was supplying 40% of the natural gas demand and 42% of the coal demand from the Europe. So it is a critical provider of all these energy sources. And all these factors, I would say, they will surely boost the energy prices, in particular, affect the European economies. And it will also probably force Europe to decrease its consumption by up to 30%, according to the International Energy Agency. It could also potentially lead to new recessions even before the impact of this current tightening cycle is observed.
Dr. Bilal, this is not only going to make the life of households more difficult, but also it's going to have serious impact on the mainstream industry, particularly for economies like Germany that make a living on their industrial manufacturing. This is a major source of their income. So this must be a very worrisome scenario for the industrial part of Germany.
Uh, in particular, the German economy, but overall, the whole European economy, it will definitely be negatively impacted. So, in 2020, there was just to remember, 6% contraction in the European economies overall. And in 2021, there was a huge increase in growth in European economies. They had a growth rate of 5.4%. And this is according to the World Bank estimates. And it was the highest growth rate since the early 1970s in Europe in general. And uh, by the beginning of 2022, the growth rates are still positive, although not as high as it is aimed for. Um, there is a 0.3% growth rate in the euro area, 0.4% in the EU in general. But the surging energy and food prices, they have increased the inflation rate, as we just talked about. They are increasing the cost of production in general, and of course, negatively affecting the industrial production in all the European economies, but especially the Europe's uh, main economies, such as Germany. They will be negatively affected, surely. And the energy crisis of late 2021, war in Ukraine, and new refugee waves from the northern Black Sea region, they are all negatively affecting the European economies nowadays.
Dr. Bilal, let's take the conversation forward. Help me to understand why Europe is not putting a complete ban on Russia's oil. We see Europe bringing up new kind of blockages or blockades or sanctions, things that are unprecedented, like a ban on import of gold. But they're not blocking the Russian oil altogether. What do you believe can be the reason for it?
Well, just as I mentioned earlier, the 25% of all the import, oil import of Europe is coming from Russia, and 40% of all natural gas, and 42% of all coal imports of Europe, they're coming from Russia. These are really huge amounts, and you definitely need time to diversify in that sense, to find new sources of natural gas, oil, even coal that is used for electrical production. So these huge dependence in general over the commodities on the Europe side, it makes it very, very difficult to completely ban all the imports.
But what does this price cap then mean? Because Europe has put a price cap on the buying of Russian oil. Because if Russia is not getting the right price, it can sell its oil elsewhere. Why would it sell to Europe altogether?
Uh, well, Russia is definitely also looking for ways to diversify its markets, energy markets, and on the other side, uh, the U.S. for at least a few decades they were pushing Europe to diversify its um, sources of commodities in general, I would say. But for the moment, there is this bilateral dependence, and they have to work on ways to deal with the current crisis, I would say.
Going forward, we would also like to take your comments on the migration or the refugees coming. There are 7 million of Ukrainians that have entered in different areas of Europe. Now, to us, this is the largest influx of refugees in Europe since the Second World War. How do you see it? Because many in Europe are propagating the positive aspect of it, but doesn't it affect the already strained supply chain of essentials of life in Europe?
Well, it is causing a lot of issues, including the public discontent in Europe. So Europe has long been dealing with migration waves from North Africa, Middle East, even Near East, and recently from the northern Black Sea, from Ukraine, as you just pointed out, about over 7 million people they have migrated. Uh, so Europe, it does indeed need younger population and labor force. So human capital is certainly one critical contribution. These migrants they could be used in. However, there is also a need for new regulations, policies to help deal with the anti-immigrant sentiment or public discontent growing in Europe. So governments, international organizations, humanitarian organizations, they need to work together to develop more comprehensive policies, actions to sustainably manage migration waves and facilitate its potential positive outcomes, I would say.
And do you believe that all these refugees will be going back, I mean, once the war is over? Because the major infrastructure of Ukraine is almost lost. There is a very serious war being fought in the heart of Ukraine. So do you believe these refugees are here to stay for a longer period of time?
Well, this is also a huge debate, even in Turkey, just as it is in Europe. Well, definitely not all of them, but there will certainly be a huge amount of these migrants going back to their home countries once peace is settled and once these economies are back on their foot. But for the moment, it seems like it will take a relatively long period, at least a decade, I would say.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bilal Begis, for being guest in our program today.
Thanks for the invite. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this was Dr. Bilal Begis from Turkey, and he was telling us about the economic challenges that Europe is facing today. One of the important factors that he mentioned, that there is a huge gap between the economies of Eastern Europe and Western Europe. The challenges for the East are far more severe and drastic than the rest of Europe, particularly the West. But even the West, or the extreme West of Europe, that is Great Britain, is taking the brunt of the energy crisis today. As he rightly pointed out, more than 9% inflation is being observed in England today. That is going to rise to another 11%. And England's economy is going into a major slump. Germany is already afraid of the upcoming gas crisis that is going to take a brunt to its industrial process. And the rest of the Europe is also quite into a catch-22 situation. Let's see how Europe cope up with all these challenges, because if diplomacy fails, there are no other good choices.